Get your fat peasant wife out of my way.
The cruelest man in the county sat atop his purebred stallion, looking down at my mud-stained husband, and laughed. "Get your fat peasant wife out of my way," Lord Alistair Thorne said, tapping his leather riding crop against his polished leather boot. He gestured toward me with naked disgust. "Before my men move her for you, I am here to collect the debt her father owes me. If he cannot pay, I am taking this cottage, the land beneath it, and her." We were standing in the muddy courtyard of the small thatched roof cottage that had been my home for the past 6 months. It was raining, a cold, miserable English drizzle that clung to my faded linen work dress and plastered my dark hair to my neck. I was 31 years old, plus size, exhausted, and terrified. I had married a poor tenant farmer to escape this exact nightmare, and now the nightmare had found me anyway. Beside me stood Arthur, my husband, a quiet, massive man with calloused hands, shoulders broad enough to block out the sun, and a face that was usually covered in the dust of the fields. He was wearing rough canvas trousers and a wool shirt that smelled of rain and earth. He was just a farmer, a man who rented land, a man who had no power against a wealthy lord with 6 armed thugs at his back. Or so I thought. "You will not touch my wife," Arthur said. His voice did not sound like a farmer's voice. Usually, Arthur spoke with a slow, quiet country rumble, but in that moment, his voice was cold, precise, and completely stripped of any provincial accent. It was the voice of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. Lord Thorne sneered. "And what will you do about it, you filthy dirt scratcher?" Thorne swung his riding crop, aiming for Arthur's face. Arthur did not flinch. He caught the leather crop in midair with his left hand. He didn't just stop it, he wrenched it from Thorne's grip with such violent, terrifying force that Thorne nearly pitched out of his saddle. Arthur snapped the thick leather and wood in half and tossed the pieces into the mud. Then, Arthur reached into the pocket of his rough canvas trousers. He pulled something out and slid it onto his right thumb. He raised his hand, wiping the mud from the object with his thumb. It was a ring, a massive, heavy gold signet ring bearing a crest that even I, a ruined gentleman's daughter, recognized instantly. The crest of a wolf and a crown, a ducal seal. "I will not do anything to you as a farmer," Arthur said softly, his gray eyes locking onto Thorne's terrified face. "But as Arthur Sterling, the 8th Duke of Blackwood, I will utterly destroy you. To understand how I ended up married to a duke disguised as a dirt farmer, you have to go back 6 months. I was the only daughter of Sir Thomas Hastings. We were gentry, but we were poor. My father was a brilliant, gentle man who loved books more than ledgers. He trusted the wrong people. Specifically, he trusted Lord Alistair Thorne, a ruthless neighboring landowner who offered my father a series of friendly loans to keep our crumbling estate afloat. When the loans came due, Thorne revealed his true nature. He demanded immediate repayment. When my father couldn't pay, the stress triggered a severe stroke that left him bedridden. Thorne arrived at our manor a week later. "I will forgive the debt, Eleanor," Thorne said, his eyes raking over my plus-size body. He didn't look at me with desire. He looked at me the way a man looks at a piece of property he intends to conquer and break. "On one condition, marry me. You will be my wife, and this estate will become mine." It was a trap. If I refused, my sick father would be thrown into debtor's prison, where he would die within a week. If I accepted, I would be tied to a cruel monster who wanted to punish me simply for existing. Thorne hated that I was a large, confident woman who had always refused his predatory advances. He wanted to own me, to break me. I asked for 3 days to consider. I walked out of the manor, down the dirt road that bordered our lands, weeping in the rain, trying to figure out how to save my father's life without destroying my own. That is where Arthur found me. Arthur was one of our tenant farmers. He had arrived in the village a year ago, a quiet, solitary giant of a man who kept to himself, worked a small patch of land near the woods, and paid his rent in cash, always on time. I had spoken to him only a handful of times when collecting the rent. He was intimidatingly large, with broad shoulders, a dark beard, and hands that looked like they could crush stone, but he had always been extraordinarily polite. He always took his cap off when I approached. He found me sitting on a stone wall in the rain, crying. "Miss Hastings," he said, his deep voice startling me. He was carrying a bundle of firewood. He set it down and looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "You are distressed." I didn't know why, but I told him. I told this quiet, massive farmer about the debt, about Thorne's ultimatum, about my father's stroke. Arthur listened in absolute silence. His jaw tightened. "How much is the debt?" he asked. £2,000, I said, a bitter laugh escaping me. It was a fortune, an impossible sum. Arthur looked out over the fields. "I have £2,000 saved, Miss Hastings." I stared at him in shock. A farmer? With £2,000? I had a previous life. Before I came to the dirt, I saved my wages. He turned back to me, his grey eyes locked on mine. "I will pay your father's debt to Lord Thorne, free and clear." "Why?" I whispered. "What could you possibly want in return?" "You," he said simply. "Marry me, Eleanor. I am a poor man now. I live in a 2-room thatched cottage. You will have to work the earth, wash your own clothes, and live simply. But I swear on my life, Thorne will never touch you, and you will never go hungry." I looked at his massive, calloused hands. I looked at the quiet, unshakable strength in his eyes. I chose the farmer. We married 3 days later in the village church. Arthur paid the solicitor £2,000 in crisp banknotes, clearing my father's debt entirely. Thorne was furious, threatening revenge, but legally, he was blocked. My father was moved into the front room of Arthur's cottage, where he could rest in peace, and I became a farmer's wife. It was the hardest work of my life. I traded my corsets and silk dresses for faded linen work gowns. I learned to bake bread, to tend the chickens, to haul water from the well. My soft hands developed calluses. My muscles ached at the end of every day. But I had never been happier, because of Arthur. I had expected a marriage of convenience, a cold arrangement, but Arthur treated me with a reverence that took my breath away. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He woke up before dawn to light the fire so I wouldn't be cold. He brought me wildflowers from the fields. And at night, in the small wooden bed in the back room of the cottage, he worshipped my body. I had spent my entire life in aristocratic circles being told I was too large, too heavy, too unfashionable to be desired. Thorne had looked at my curves with disgust. But Arthur looked at my wide hips, my full breasts, my soft stomach, and he looked at me like I was a religious awakening. "You are a harvest, Eleanor," he whispered one night, his rough, calloused hands tracing the curve of my waist in the dark. "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. You take up space in my life, and I never want you to shrink." For 6 months, I lived in a state of exhausting, beautiful peace. I thought I knew the man I had married, a strong, quiet farmer who loved the earth and loved his plus-size wife. I had no idea I was sleeping next to the most powerful duke in England. The peace shattered on a Tuesday morning. Lord Thorne had not forgiven my rejection. He had spent 6 months digging through my father's old legal documents, bribing clerks and searching for a loophole. And he found one. An old, forgotten promissory note signed by my father years ago, buried in a secondary ledger, giving Thorne the right to seize our remaining assets, which, according to the corrupt local magistrate Thorne had paid off, included the cottage we were renting. I was outside hanging laundry on the line when I heard the sound of galloping horses. Thorne rode into the muddy courtyard, flanked by 6 large, heavily armed thugs. "Did you really think you could escape me by marrying a dirt scratcher, Eleanor?" Thorne sneered, looking down at me. "The cottage is mine. Your father's debt is not fully paid. My men are going inside right now to drag that old cripple out into the rain." "You can't do this," I screamed, dropping the laundry basket. "I am a lord of the realm. I can do whatever I please to a peasant." Thorne laughed. He pointed his riding crop at me. "Grab her. If she struggles, tie her up. I'll deal with her later." 2 of the massive thugs dismounted and lunged toward me. I backed up against the rough stone wall of the cottage, my heart hammering in my throat. The front door of the cottage burst open. Arthur stepped out into the rain. He didn't yell, he didn't run. He walked with a terrifying, measured stillness that I had never seen in him before. One of the thugs reached for my arm. Arthur moved. It was not the clumsy, brawling fighting style of a farmer. It was the lethal, precise, devastatingly efficient combat training of an aristocratic military officer. Arthur grabbed the thug's outstretched arm, twisted it with a sickening crack, and drove his knee into the man's chest, sending him flying backward into the mud. The second thug pulled a blade. Arthur sidestepped the thrust with impossible speed, struck the man in the throat, and disarmed him before the knife even hit the ground. Within 10 seconds, 2 men were screaming in the mud, and the other 4 were backing away in absolute terror. "You will not touch my wife," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, losing every trace of the country accent he had used for a year. Thorne was apoplectic. "You assaulted my men. You are a peasant. I will have you hanged for striking a peer's men. Magistrate, arrest this filth." Thorne swung his riding crop. Arthur caught it, snapped it, and reached into his pocket. And that was the moment he pulled out the gold signet ring. "I will not do anything to you as a farmer," Arthur said softly, wiping the mud from the wolf and crown crest. "But as Arthur Sterling, the 8th Duke of Blackwood, I will utterly destroy you." The silence in the courtyard was absolute. Even the rain seemed to hold its breath. Thorne stared at the heavy gold ring. He looked at Arthur's face, really looked at it, past the beard and the mud, and recognition finally dawned. The Duke of Blackwood was a legend, a war hero, one of the 3 wealthiest men in the empire. He had vanished from high society a year ago, sparking endless rumors. He hadn't vanished. He had been growing turnips and sleeping in a wooden bed with a ruined gentleman's plus-sized daughter. Your Grace," Thorne stammered, his face turning the color of ash. He practically fell off his horse, dropping to his knees in the mud. I had no idea." "You are trespassing on my wife's land," Arthur, the Duke, said. His voice was ice. "You have threatened my family. You have forged legal documents to harass a Duchess of the realm. My solicitors in London are already drafting the warrants. By nightfall, your estates will be seized. By tomorrow, you will be in the Tower." Thorne opened his mouth to beg. Arthur didn't let him. "Get off my land before I forget my station and finish what I started with your men." Thorne and his thugs fled like beaten dogs. And then, Arthur turned to me. He looked down at the ring on his thumb, then looked at my face. The cold, aristocratic fury vanished, replaced by the gentle, anxious eyes of the farmer who brought me wildflowers. "Eleanor," he said softly, taking a step toward me. I took a step back. "You lied to me," I whispered. "For 6 months. You let me scrub floors and break my back and cry over pennies. And you are a duke?" "I can explain," he pleaded, reaching for my hand. "Do not touch me," I said, my voice shaking. "I married an honest farmer. I don't know who you are." Within 2 hours, the illusion of my simple life was completely dismantled. A massive, lacquered black carriage bearing the ducal crest arrived at our humble cottage, followed by a retinue of liveried servants. They carried my sick father on a velvet litter, treating him with the utmost care under the supervision of a royal physician Arthur had summoned. I sat in the velvet-lined carriage opposite my husband. I was still wearing my faded, mud-stained linen work dress. He had washed his face and changed into a clean, severely tailored black coat that one of his valets had brought. He looked like a duke now. He looked terrifying. "Why?" I asked, staring out the window as we left the village behind. Arthur rested his elbows on his knees, leaning forward, his large hands clasped together. 2 years ago, I returned from the war, Arthur said quietly. I was suffocating. The aristocracy, the balls, the endless parade of people who only saw my title, my wealth, the crest on my ring. They were vultures. I was drowning in the falseness of it all, so I left. I bought a small parcel of land under an assumed name, grew a beard, and worked the earth. I wanted to feel something real. And then you saw a desperate woman crying on a wall, I said bitterly, and you decided to play savior. No, Arthur said, his voice fierce. I saw you months before that. I watched you walking the fields, treating your father's tenants with kindness. I watched you laugh. I saw how beautiful you were. I was already in love with you, Eleanor. But I knew if I revealed myself as a duke, you would marry me out of duty, or fear, or desperation to save your father. He reached across the carriage, his calloused fingers lightly touching my knee. I wanted you to choose me, he whispered, the man, not the title, when you chose the poor farmer with dirt on his hands over the wealthy lord offering you a manor. It was the greatest honor of my life. I stared at him. The betrayal was real, but so was the love in his eyes. We arrived at Blackwood Manor just as the sun set. It was not a house, it was a palace. Massive stone towers, sweeping manicured lawns, a driveway lined with ancient oaks. 100 servants stood in perfect formation on the front steps, bowing as the carriage pulled to a halt. "Welcome home, Your Grace," the imposing butler said as Arthur helped me down. I stood there in my wet, muddy linen dress, a plus-size farmer's wife, surrounded by more wealth than I could comprehend. I felt ridiculous. I felt small. Arthur sensed it immediately. He didn't instruct his servants to take me away. He didn't hide me. He took my hand, laced his fingers through mine, and walked me up the grand staircase himself, pausing only to announce to the sprawling staff, "This is Eleanor. She is the Duchess of Blackwood. Her word is my own." That night, a team of maids drew a hot bath in a marble tub. They washed the mud from my hair. They brought out an entire wardrobe of exquisite gowns that Arthur had secretly commissioned for me months ago, having memorized my exact measurements perfectly. They dressed me in an emerald green velvet riding habit. It was tailored masterfully. It didn't try to hide my wide hips or compress my full bust. It celebrated my body. It made me look like royalty. I walked into the master bedchamber. Arthur was standing by the massive stone fireplace, staring into the flames. He turned when I entered. He stopped breathing. "You look," Arthur started, his voice thick with emotion. He shook his head. "I always knew you were a queen. I just finally have the money to dress you like one." "It's beautiful," I said softly, touching the velvet. I looked up at him. "My father is resting comfortably. The physician says he will recover fully with proper care." "He will never want for anything again," Arthur promised. I walked closer to him. The anger had burned itself out in the carriage, leaving only the profound, terrifying reality that my entire life had changed. "You lied to me, Arthur." "I did," he admitted, his gray eyes filled with regret. "And I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you. I was selfish. I wanted to know I was loved for myself." "You let me wash your muddy trousers in a tin bucket," I pointed out, a small, reluctant smile pulling at the corner of my mouth. Arthur let out a breath that was half a laugh. "I actually enjoyed watching you boss me around the kitchen." "Dukes don't get bossed around often." Forgive or walk away. I could walk away. I could demand an annulment based on fraud. I could refuse to be a duchess because the foundation of our marriage was built on a massive deception. Or I could forgive him. I could look at the man who had worked the earth with me, who had worshipped my plus-size body in a tiny wooden bed, who had stepped in front of armed thugs to protect me, and accept that his protection and his love were absolute reality, even if his name was not. I chose to forgive. I reached up and placed my hands on his broad chest. "You are the Duke of Blackwood," I whispered, "but if you think you are never doing the dishes again, Your Grace, you are sorely mistaken." Arthur crushed me to his chest, burying his face in my neck, holding me like a man who had been starving and was finally allowed to eat. "I am your farmer, Eleanor. Forever. The title is just paperwork." 1 year later, Lord Alistair Thorne lost everything. Arthur's solicitors tore his empire apart piece by piece. His lands were seized to pay back the people he had defrauded. He was stripped of his peerage and exiled to a penal colony. I never saw him again. My father made a full recovery. He spends his days in the grand library of Blackwood Manor, surrounded by thousands of books, perfectly content. As for me, I am the Duchess of Blackwood. I wear emerald velvet and diamonds. I host balls for the highest aristocracy in the land, and I make them all uncomfortable, because I do not shrink myself, I do not apologize for my plus-size body, and I do not tolerate their snobbery. They are terrified of my husband, and they have learned to be terrified of me. But my favorite days are the quiet ones. When the harvest comes, Arthur and I leave the manor. He takes off his tailored coat. I take off my jewels. We walk down to the fields, and we stand in the dirt. Because beauty is not a size, and true power is not a title. True power is finding a man who will break an aristocrat's arm for insulting you, who will hide a dukedom just to win your heart, and who will look at your wide hips and full curves and tell you, every single day, that you are the greatest harvest of his life. Forgive or walk away? If the poor farmer you married to save your family turned out to be the wealthiest duke in England in disguise, would you forgive his lie, because he protected you and loved you for exactly who you are? Or would you walk away because the entire foundation of your marriage was a deception? Comment forgive or walk away below. Subscribe for a new emotional story every week. Hit the bell so you never miss the next one. This story is fictional, for entertainment only. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.